The Riesending Cave Rescue. The emergency team immediately jumped into action and began planning Johann's rescue. Much was made of the daunting nature of a potential operation into the Riesending, as it posed numerous risks to any such attempts. Later, however, on that same evening that the call had been made, the first rescue team arrived at the entrance. They consisted of a mountain and cave rescuer with mountain rescue paramedic training and a cave explorer with local knowledge. Due to time and resource constraints, they came with minimal medical equipment and provisions. They worked their way inside and arrived at Johann's position after only about 7 hours. A second squad, including a cave rescue doctor, arrived at the entrance around midnight. Their equipment consisted of analgesics, antibiotics, steroids for intracranial pressure therapy, and some IV fluids. However, the second team failed to reach Johann. This was due to the technical difficulties of navigating the cave as well as the extreme psychological stress caused by the environmental conditions of the rescue. Sadly, they weren't the only team that didn't reach their goal in those first few days. An SMS system known as CaveLink was eventually established to send and receive essential communications through the solid rock of the Untersberg. It allowed for an exchange of text messages between those entering the cave and those at the scene of the accident. Meanwhile, in little time, a conglomerative team of over 700 cave rescuers from 5 different nations had assembled just outside the entrance to the Riesending. These included experienced cavers from Germany, Austria, Italy, Croatia, and Switzerland. They established a base camp on the karst slopes of the Untersberg and made proper preparations for Johann's medical care and rescue. Getting supplies to the base camp was not always easy, however, and multiple language barriers had to be overcome as the multinational group sought to coordinate their efforts. Despite the difficulties, the unifying need to rescue Johann brought the group together, as everyone did everything in their power to help the process along. A second message reached the personnel of the Medical Operations Management up on the surface on the morning of June 9th. After a phase of fluctuating consciousness and agitation, Johann had fallen into a coma. He was observed to be having seizures at ever shorter intervals. These were evaluated as signs of an increase in intracranial pressure, which, under these circumstances, could only be treated by rest and a low-stimulus environment, as well as drug therapy. Starting his transportation to the surface seemed unthinkable at this time. This was taken into account for the rescue plan. Nevertheless, work continued on, expanding the rescue route while minimizing the risk to the emergency services. In small groups, ropes were added and replaced, stepping stones set, loose stones fastened, cave telephones and cave radios installed, and the bivouacs expanded. Later that evening, a group of very experienced Swiss cave rescuers and a specially qualified paramedic reached Johann and supplemented his medical care. On the evening of June 11th, 3.5 days after the incident, Martin Goxel, a doctor, managed to reach Johann. After a descent of about 11 hours walking time, through dark, deep shafts next to thundering waterfalls, through clayey collapse zones, and partly unreal, playfully shaped chasms, he reached a dark hall. It had a 25-meter diameter, an 18-meter height on the one side, and another 18 meters on the other. Boulders up to the size of a small truck covered the part of the dry clay soil closest to the surface. On a halfway level part, a golden heap glittered in the glow of some helmet lamps. Muffled conversation could be heard, and clouds of air could be seen rising. It turned out that the heap of fabric was Johann, dry under sleeping bags and emergency blankets. Koksu's first impression was not encouraging. There was no reaction to speech, shaking, or pain stimuli. From preliminary information, the doctor knew he at least had a fractured skull base and hypertension. A second physician arrived later that same night. After a short talk, an initial in-depth examination was carried out. In the first telephone call between a reporter and the 2 rescue doctors, Johann's condition was fully revealed. Fluctuations in consciousness, a severely gaping head laceration, a hematoma, and nosebleeds were observed. The working diagnosis was severe craniocerebral trauma, or TBI, with a suspected skull-base fracture. Medical supplies for blood pressure regulation, anti-epileptic and cortisone therapy, antibiotics, and intravenous feeding were on hand. However, they had no monitors or alarms to keep a closer eye on his condition. A heat tent was erected with tarpaulins and rescue blankets over a line stretched across the room. Several hours of uncertainty passed before the first primitive communication with Johann was possible. A simple handshake. 1 shake for yes, 2 for no. Soon Johann could even stand up, an action often followed again and again by phases of deep sleep. Over the course of the next 2 days, they communicated with the surface via the SMS Cavelink system. Altogether, Johann was diagnosed with a minor traumatic brain injury, and it was decided that he was fit to be transported out of the cave. Additional help was needed for this task, which was requested from Italy. German, Austrian, and Swiss forces were largely exhausted at this point. This meant that other emergency doctors with experience in caves were also available. Much like the fabled dwarves waiting on Emperor Charlemagne in the depths of the mountain, a kind of work shift with 9 medical personnel attending on Johann could be assured. Elaborate medical logistics for infusions, paraneural nutrition, antibiotics, steroids, anti-epileptic drugs, and tube feeding, as well as hygiene articles and warming material was established. A medical situation report and the constant presence of a doctor in the operations center made briefing and debriefing of the cave's medical forces possible. In addition, an emergency doctor was constantly on standby for the emergency services personnel both inside as well as in front of the entrance. Such was the possible danger of the extraction operation that even the rescuers might need their own rescuers. The doctors down below waited for the start of the transport process, making tea and noodles as they watched over Johann. Finally, the stretcher reached them, a fiberglass toboggan that had been transformed into a shock-proof carriage for Johann's safety. Johann was wrapped in protective padding and strapped inside. The rescuers then broke camp in, quote, the hospital with the most massive roof in the world. The transport through the narrow passages and the supplying of people both inside and outside the cave was challenging. The paths within the cave had to be secured with additional fixed ropes, bolts, and footrests. At times of highest activity, the cave was occupied by up to 60 people. Furthermore, around 90% of all cave rescue equipment belonging to the Bavarian Mountain Rescue, or Bergwacht, had been deployed into the bowels of the Riesending. Unfortunately, there were no engines or other machinery available to the rescuers. All work along the kilometers-long labyrinth of passageways, caverns, and shafts had to be done manually, by hands and shoulders, legs, and knees. Sometimes the stretcher was rolled over their knees or on their backs as they carried it. At other points in vertical passages, they even had to use their own bodies as counterweights to help to lift the stretcher along. The morning of June 19th was tense and saw the rescuers acting extremely cautiously, standing silently around the entrance of the cave even as they watched the man they had come to save slowly rising from the darkness. Even a minor mistake at this point could still threaten his life. Then, at 11:44 a.m., more than 11 days after the incident, and 12 since he had descended inside, Johann returned fully into the light of day. Shortly after noon, he was airlifted to the Murnau Trauma Center in Bavaria via a federal police helicopter. He left to the tune of cheers and applause from the crowd of rescuers. Many of the hardiest of those involved were in tears at this moment. For them, the tension of the last few days was dispelled, leaving them with the knowledge that all their efforts had succeeded in saving Johann's life. Many congratulations were made, and a sense of family among the rescuers of many nations could be felt. Johann spent 2 weeks in the trauma center, including an operation the following week for his fractured cheekbone. He then underwent several months of rehabilitation. The local authorities, for whom the media attention had caused numerous headaches, executed the consequences of the accident. The danger of future missions in the Riesending cave is just too great, said Thomas Weber, the mayor of Bischofweissen district. The extreme public accessibility has led us to submit a request for the closure of the cave. A week after the incident, the local council voted on closing down the cave. At the end of June, the entrance to the Riesending was sealed by police to prevent further accidents by curious people and tourists. A special access permit is now required. It is only available to people who can justify their interests, show that they are physically suitable for the environment, and prove that they have professional qualifications. In August 2015, 1 year later, the Bavarian Ministry of the Interior placed the total sum of the rescue's expenses at approximately 960,000 euros. adjusted for gradual inflation as well as currency equivalents. This today comes up to around 1,152,225 euros, or $1,233,688.16. The Free State of Bavaria bore a large part of the cost, including for helicopter operations by the Bavarian police, material for the mountain rescue service, as well as salary payments for the volunteers. Johann, himself a cave rescuer prior to his incident, made, quote, a not inconsiderable contribution, according to the ministry. The share corresponds to his income and assets. It was deemed to be disproportionate to take full financial recourse from Westhauser. Johann was able to recover from his injuries and gradually began exploring caves again in 2016. It took 6 years, until 2020, for cleanup operations within the cave to conclude. More than 1 ton of garbage from the rescue effort was removed and brought to the surface, mostly comprised of food scraps, plastic packaging, drills, batteries, and medical material. This was important for the ecosystem of the cave. Ecologically speaking, debris and other hazardous substances within caves can pollute the groundwater as well as the habitat of bats and other cave animals. In 2016, Johann would be interviewed about how his life had been since the incident. He was noted as having something to rectify for himself and his 2,500 colleagues from the Association of German Speleologists and Karst Researchers. Since the accident, the question of what speleologists are actually doing down inside such deep and dangerous caves had been swirling over everything. Criticism was resonating in the question. It was often remarked that the benefit of caving was not in proportion to the risk. Johann Westhauser saw it differently. For him, there is still much research to be done. As he walks with his interviewer into a cave, something changes in his behavior. Johann, who is usually shy, suddenly starts talking and doesn't stop. He talks about his research. He talks about his rescuer, Sabine Zimmerbrenner, who died in 2015 when a stone fell on her head in the Untersberg. He talks about his accident, and about his memories from those 9 days when he was carried back to the light on a stretcher.